Let's begin together as we continue now in our study of curious questions on the meaning of life with Qohelet. And we are now continuing together with chapter 3. לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים, עת ללדת ועת למות, עת לטעת ועת לעקור נטוע, עת להרוג ועת לרפוא, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות, עת לבכות ועת לשחוק, עת צפוד ועת רקוד, עת להשליך אבנים ועת כנוס אבנים, עת לחבוק ועת לרחוק מחבק, עת לבקש ועת לאבד, עת לשמור ועת להשליך, עת לקרוע ועת לתפור, עת לחשות ועת לדבר, עת לאהוב ועת לשנוא, עת מלחמה ועת שלום. מה יתרון העושה באשר הוא עמל? ראיתי את העניין אשר נתן אלוהים לבני האדם לענות בו, את הכל עשה יפה בעיתו, גם את העולם נתן בליבם, מבלי אשר לא ימצא אדם את המעשה אשר עשה אלוהים מראש ועד סוף. ידעתי כי אין טוב בם, כי אם לשמוח ולעשות טוב בחייו, וגם האדם שיאכל ושתה וראה טוב בכל עמלו, מתת אלוהים היא. ידעתי כי כל אשר יעשה אלוהים, הוא יהיה לעולם, עליו אין להוסיף וממנו אין לגרוע, ואלוהים מעשו שיראו מלפניו, מה שהיה כבר הוא, ואשר להיות כבר היה, ואלוהים יבקש את נרדף. ועוד ראיתי תחת השמש מקום המשפט, שמה הרשע, ומקום הצדק, שמה הרשע. אמרתי אני בליבי את הצדיק, ואת הרשע ישפוט האלוהים, כי את לכל חפץ, ואת כל המעשה שם. אמרתי אני בליבי, על דברת בני האדם לברם האלוהים לראות, שהם בהמה המה להם, כי מקרה בני האדם ומקרה הבהמה, מקרה אחד להם כמות זה, כן מות זה. ברוח אחד לכל ומותר האדם מן הבהמה אין, כי הכל הבל, הכל הולך אל מקום אחד, הכל היה מן העפר והכל שב אל עפר. מי יודע רוח בני אדם העולה היא, למעלה ורוח הבהמה היורדת היא למטה לארץ. וראיתי כי אין טוב מאשר ישמח האדם במעשיו, כי הוא חלקו, כי מי יביאנו לראות במה שיהיה אחריו. So that is chapter 3. Bev, would you like to read the translation for us?
Okay. I have the study Bible.
Do you want to do this one or his?
Should I do yours?
Whichever you like. The one that I have is from a combination of Alter and JPS, so you can use that one. Study Bible has a bit of JPS, whatever's easier for you.
Okay, it's easier in my lap, okay?
Mm-hmm.
For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this, so that all shall stand in awe before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already is, and God seeks out what has gone by. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to human beings that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. Who can bring them to see what will be after them?
Right. So this is a very famous and renowned passage. Of course, depending on your translation, it may evoke for you the memory of a pop song. Do you remember the song that was made famous?
Sure.
Sure.
What was it called? To
You
Every
said
Season?
for
Yeah,
every season by the Birds, right?
exactly, right. Turn, turn. So the Birds used this as an inspiration. Nina Simone, there's a number of artists who've covered it. And it's interesting that in the 50s and 60s, this was something that was resonating. As Dylan was singing, the times they are changing. Somehow this was also an understanding of how time works that resonated with the tumultuous uncertainty of the 1960s, but it's obviously a timeless observation that Qohelet makes in terms of the way that time works. I'll just retranslate or offer another translation of the first opening verse. Then what I want to do is share some reflections with you, and also to see if you have any questions or observations about specific parts of these passages, the way they were translated, the way that you understand them, and the way that they might apply to the way that we live our lives. Because Qohelet really, remember, is interested in the way that these curious questions affect our ability to experience our lives. And that's the way that we've been looking at his text, or at Qohelet's text. L'chol zman ve'et v'chol chefetz tachat hashamayim is the way that things open in the first verse. And even though I will eventually go with a time for being born, a time for death, a time for planting, a time for rooting, I've taken a different way of looking at verse 1 to suggest the following. It's more of an interpretation that all of life is fleeting, the passing of moments upon moments. Embrace them as they come and don't cling to them as they go. In this alone is their tranquility. Now, we go through a series of different etim. Take a look and see if you can count how many of them there are, and we can consider whether that has significance for Qohelet. But in general, from verses 1 through 9, what I wanted to suggest is for us to consider how we experience time in our lives. And what Qohelet seems to be suggesting is that there is a suffering that is natural to the flow of time, only when we resist it. If we resist the flow of time, then we suffer. But if we live in the moment and we attend to being present to what happens in each moment, remember we spoke about this last time about mikre, that is not the fate that is destined to happen to us, but the presence of a moment as it is happening to us, the event itself. And we have the ability, the expansiveness to be able to accept whatever happens, then we alleviate suffering and we can move to a place of greater tranquility. And this is an approach that's challenging for us because our nature is to try to control and to hold on to time and to things that occur within time. And when we let go of that illusion of trying to control and to become attached to things or to become overly judgmental, then the possibility of living a life that's more balanced, more open to the sense of equanimity and to tranquility then becomes possible. So let's go over those first 9 verses and see if there's specific questions or observations or comments that you have about the first 9 verses. And then I want to go into verse 10 and then take a look at 12 through 15. So anything that you notice or questions that you have about the first 9 verses about the E-team, did anyone count to see how many there are in this beautiful, very economic use of language? Again, this makes you appreciate the power of Hebrew, and specifically of this late biblical Hebrew, to really be able to capture, not just as a catalog, but this passage is really about circumstances in life and the flow of events that is captured with a beautiful sense of antinomy, these series of pairs that are starkly contrasted. Each of the pairs underscores the point that's already stated, and it amasses this series of pairs. Antinomies in philosophy means that it's a thing and its opposite, and it's embracing that paradox, and specifically, it's embracing the opposition that occurs between those pairs. Did you notice how many there were?
There are 14.
There's 14 of them. And we can think about whether there's any significance to that. Does it strike you?
Well, it's twice 7.
Right. And what is the significance of 7 in
7 is a holy number.
And why is it a holy number?
The 7 days of the week, and
a cycle of completion. So it's actually very significant in the biblical mind. 7 is an order of completion, and so these are a series of antinomies based on 7, which is actually important. It shows the sense that there are cycles that are operating, and there is opposition within those cycles too. Very good.
I'd like to just push back up for a second. If you say it raises the issue of living in the moment, but in fact, for me, when you say there's a time, a time to be born and a time to die, it's not just in the moment, because it's looking, well, in that sense, it's looking to the future. But even for some of these other things, you may be on one side, but you're being along the other side. So you're not necessarily just in the moment. You're in the moment and its opposite.
Okay, so then how would that work in relationship to a time to being born, or a time for being born, a time for dying? So you're.
I mean, if you think of it in terms of other people, you could say, well, some people are being born and some people are dying. Or if it's about myself, you can either do it literally, in which case it's the boundary of one's life, or you can do it metaphorically, in which case one grows and then one devolves and one grows again and devolves.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you generalize the translation to be something more like a time for birth and a time for death,
mm-hmm.
then those are
right.
Events and emotional states that we live through multiple times in our lives. Like, to me, it just strikes me that all these things are transient, and that's why it's about being in the moment, because nothing is forever. Everything comes. These things will each come many times. Right.
That's right. So depending on whether it's in your own subjective experience of yourself and your own existence, or whether you're open to your relationship that you have with others, right? You could be experiencing, not only do you, in a sense, live through your own birthing, because that's what allows you to exist, and then eventually we all die, but we may live through multiple births and multiple deaths in our lives in relationship to others, right?
What strikes me is they're like bookends. Either all of these stanzas are bookends.
Mm-hmm.
And what strikes me is you better make the most of what you do in between those times.
That's very important.
Yeah, you have markers. You're born, you die, you plant, you pluck up. What have you done in between that's relevant vis-a-vis God or vis-a-vis being a person in the world?
Right, and that really is what happens in as you go through verse 9 and 10. You have these moments and the passing of moments, and as exactly as you said, this is life. Really, what happens between those bookends is your life.
Exactly.
So
Life is in between these moments,
Yeah.
or life is made up of these moments.
In between, how you're living your life in between these moments is what's significant.
that's where you have the potential to make meaning
That's right.
as a human being, and that's what Qohelet is struggling with. And there is, what he's trying to point out is that there's a natural flow, and there's also no escaping these things. At some point, you will be born. At some point, you will die. At some point, you will. That those can be, existentially your own markers as a human being, but as a parent and as a grandparent, as someone who's in relation to others, you may experience those bookends a number of times within the course of your relationships with others. But if you don't understand how they work within the framework of your own life and how to make meaning of them, then how can you be expected to appreciate the meaningfulness of them in relationship to your experience of your relation with others? It starts with your own experience. That's what Qohelet is always trying to examine and to re-examine. And Qohelet's trying to draw from the particular to the general, right? Because it talks about those moments, and then verse 10 says, "I've seen the task," right? Verse 10, right? I've seen the task that God has given to humanity to be exercised, and for us, in a sense, to be able to answer to. And it's exactly as Bev is saying, that what God gives to the human being and to the human species is the ability to be able to be accountable for what happens between those bookmarks. It depends on what you want to do with it. To the degree that you are empowered to, you can't control it, but you can imbue it with meaning. So what kind of meaning do you want to give in between those bookmarks, right?
Right.
And then it goes on.
Could I ask you something about your translation?
Yes.
You chose to use the gerund in each case, whereas
JPS, you used it as infinitives, right? A time to be born, a time to die.
Why did you choose that?
I was playing with just the sense of it being a process.
Yeah.
And I think it works both ways. It just really depends. If you look at the Hebrew grammatically, it really should be the infinitive rather than the gerund. So I may end up, after going through it again, go back to the infinitive. I keep going back and forth, trying to find a way to capture it in the English that shows there is a process undergoing.
The gerund's different in Hebrew, isn't it?
Yeah. It would be et la leda and et la mita. So it's not literal, it's more figurative, and I may end up, now that we're talking about it, going back to the infinitive. And then the question is what does the infinitive connote for us? That's an interesting question.
It connotes the action or the imperative almost. Although it's hard to think of to kill as an imperative, but maybe, well, it is in some cases.
Right. So we'll give that some more thought. I think it's a great point, Morten. Thank you for returning us to the Hebrew. Then let's take a look at a few other clusters for some comments and reflection. Verse 10, part of what Qohelet is suggesting is that there's a certain clarity that Qohelet is able to discern. And part of that clarity is the ability to be able to see where the place of suffering is within life. And what becomes more clear is that we suffer the more that we remain ignorant of impermanence. Remember, chapter 1, verse 2 was Hevel Havalim we spoke about together. How do you translate chapter 1, verse 2 is really the key to the whole book. And so if you say that it's futility, utter futility, or vanity upon vanities, as opposed to merest breath or breath upon breath, complete utter emptiness, empty of permanence, it gives a different tone into the way that we look at every time that that motif recurs throughout throughout the book. So I'm suggesting that part of what Qohelet is challenging us to do is not to disabuse ourselves of this ignorance that we have as human beings, of the impermanence of things. That's the reason why we went through the bookends as well, because the bookends are just markers, but they're not really permanent, right? Because the cycles are constantly flowing. So everything rises and everything falls. Everything has an ingression and an egression within the flow of time. Everything flows and transforms. And what part of what Qohelet is suggesting too is that change is the only constant. And we have to find a way, as Bev was saying, to make time count in between those markers. If everything under the sun is constantly in flux, as Qohelet continues to say, and it's all about flux and flow, about being diverse and separate, then clearly this cannot be the whole meaning of existence. There has to be a deeper truth beyond the sun, right? He makes this division between what happens under the sun, beneath the sun, and beyond the sun. What we spoke of last time as the physical world as opposed to the metaphysical reality. So we are at least being offered the possibility that there's a deeper truth. He hasn't really articulated it completely yet, and has only been really one or two passing references to God as Elohim. But we are invited to begin the process of trying to embrace the many and the manifold within this greater perspective of the one. But we're really focused primarily on our physical empirical reality and what happens under the sun. Qohelet just keeps coming back to that as a refrain. We'll see there's moments where Qohelet is willing to move a little bit beyond that, but primarily the experience of suffering that happens in life is a function of being primarily focused on only what happens under the sun. It's part of the paradox and one of the markers that Qohelet is making as well, where we have to ask ourselves, well, if there is what happens under the sun, then what happens beyond, right? Any other reflections on 10 and 11 or questions? Let's take a look at 12 through 15, just as that cluster, and then I want to share with you a comment, an interesting gloss that comes on verse 15. That's an interesting misreading in the Hasidic interpretation of this verse. But 12 through 15 suggests that reality is what it is. There really is no changing what happens. There's really only our response to or reaction to a given situation. We can either accept it or we can reject it. If we accept a situation or a happening, then that leads to peace. And if we reject what happens in a situation, then we suffer, right? Qohelet is observing what's happening in life and within existence. That God, from Qohelet's perspective, pursues you with peace insofar as God offers you each moment as a reprieve from suffering by the way that we acknowledge the transience of the moment, but also our gratitude and appreciation for whatever it is that we can appreciate within that moment. And there's nothing to really be gained ultimately by rejecting what is. We have to learn to absorb what happens with acceptance, to allow ourselves to return to an original sense of hishtavut. He doesn't use the language of hishtavut. It's a Hasidic concept that comes later, but the idea already is present in the Psalms, that if we keep this this understanding or relationship to what is beyond the sun, the metaphysical reality of God giving us these opportunities at each moment, then it's possible in that parallel wisdom text of the Psalms to be able to say Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, that I keep this awareness of this opportunity to keep the presence of the divine in these opportunities, to be able to accept them with appreciation, and to be able to distill from whatever happens some sense of gratitude that allows me to then be able to cultivate a sense of gratitude. Now, what's interesting here is I wanted to try in certain places, and it's an interesting task to try to find the way that Judaism, as a history of ideas, and specifically in the history of interpretation, looks at this strange book. We've spoken together about really how strange this book is, and there's not a huge amount of commentary on it, but I'm looking here and there, and I'm constantly surprised by some of the comments that that pop up. One of them that emerged this time from Reb Nachman of Breslov, who I would have expected would have embraced this book more in his teachings, but he only is peppered with a few places here and there where he turns to it. But in verse 15, there's an interesting turn of phrase, depending on how we interpret it. So verse 15 says, what is occurring occurred long since, and what is to occur occurred long since, and God seeks the pursued. That's JPS's translation. So God seeks the pursued. In the Hebrew, ha-Elohim yevakesh et ha-nirdaf, could also be translated differently, that God seeks what has already been sought, right? Which is a variant of there's nothing new under the sun, because we have to appreciate in the Hebrew the roots bet kuf shin, to seek, and resh daled pei, to pursue, really are synonyms. And that's something that's important. So what the early interpreters of this verse read it as suggesting is that seeks here means to care for or to be solicitous, and pursued actually refers to persecuted people, right? So then you have the rendering which suggests God looks after the oppressed, which is a little bit different than saying God seeks what has already been sought, right? So on this basis, you see, for example, a later interpreter, Ben Sira, shapes Qohelet's saying into a proverb, which is rendered as follows in Ben Sira 5:3, do not say who can overcome my power, for God seeks those who are pursued. So that's one way of trying to begin the process of carrying forward an interpretation. Who can overcome my power? For God seeks those who are pursued. Now, when we look at the rabbinic interpretation that we've touched on a little bit together called Qohelet Rabbah, that's the exegesis, here, God always seeks or requires the blood of the pursued from the pursuers, as in, for example, going back and choosing the offerings of Abel, whose name was Hevel in the Hebrew, very important to Qohelet, who was pursued by his brother Cain in Genesis 4:4, or, for example, in saving Noah, who was thought to have been persecuted by his generation, as we see in Genesis 7:1. So that's one way of being able to render it. But Reb Nachman has a very interesting way of reading this verse that I wanted to suggest and to reflect on for a moment, which is as follows: that God, Elohim nevakesh et ha-nirdaf, means that God sides with the oppressed insofar as saving the oppressed. In that process of saving the oppressed, it's not conditioned by a person's deeds. That is to say, the way Rabbi Nachman is reading it is that God will always side with someone who is pursued or tormented by others, whether or not that person is deserving. Even, let's say, if the oppressor is righteous and the one being oppressed is wicked. Why? Because that calculus on the outside is not something that we have the capacity to ultimately compute. God remains the ultimate arbiter of justice, which remains a mystery for Qohelet. Qohelet doesn't try to understand that calculus because under the sun it doesn't always compute. But what that means for Reb Nachman is that no human being has the right to oppress or to punish another, even when it appears as though that person is unquestionably deserving of punishment, other than in matters that are trusted to the courts. So when the oppressor takes on this role inappropriate to ultimately execute God's judgment, then God automatically sides with the oppressed one. So it's not our place, as my bubby would say, to be God's Cossack. It is our place ultimately to relinquish that to the authorities, and then to be able to abide in the patience that allows for God to make the final judgment, which is not something that human beings excel at doing. Right? We're always very quick to snap judgments, and Qohelet is trying to slow down. And Reb Nachman picks up on that and suggests perhaps another way of being able to look at it. Now, when we get to verses 16 through 17, it's interesting what happens in this shift. There's a shift moving from the order of nature to turn to the order of society. And what does Qohelet notice when looking at the way society is structured, moving from nature to society now? You see?
Injustice and righteousness devolve to wickedness.
Yeah, it seems like a very cynical approach to almost a libertarian approach to the world, right? To say, when you look at the way society is structured, I notice there's nothing but corruption and evil. Time haunts us all, but there's a difference. We have to find a way to be able to let go of holding on to time. And we could say perhaps that what Qohelet notices here in this shift, by looking at 16 and 17, and this is where I turn to Alter to try to get a more exact translation. This is what I noticed. Moreover, in verse 16, did I see under the sun the following: the place of judgment, wickedness, and in the place of justice, the wicked there abide. So there is a concern about the institutions as well as the ideals that are supposed to be ultimately these divine ideals when they become instantiated in the human realm under the sun. Where judgment is supposed to be rendered, there is wickedness, that is in the courts. And in the place of justice, right? So it's both with what the judge is executing as well as within the court system itself. He sees corruption and evil. And I said in my heart, verse 17, the just and the wicked, God will have to judge them, for there is a time and for every purpose and for every deed assessed. There is an assessment that comes. There is an accounting that Qohelet is confident will, in time, there will be that accounting. Let's take a look at a little further on and then see if we have any other reflections or questions. 18 through 20 again takes us back to this claim Qohelet makes through the bookmarks at the beginning in the E-team section of the 14, the 7 and 7, in terms of those markers of time. All are born and all will die. And given this truth, it's no wonder then people will say that the human fate and the beast's fate really are the same, because in the end, whether you're human or whether you're an animal, still what we share is that regardless of the difference of the species, we share the same fate in terms of both eventually having to confront the reality of dying. Now, God tests you with that truth, and then ultimately asks us, will this truth of having to confront our own mortality free us to truly live, or does it frighten us to death before our time? And that is a major question that Qohelet is now going to challenge us to struggle with, is that if we do share the same fate as the beast, even though we are human, and even though we may share a spirit in common, right? That is to say, remember that in the Bible there is nefesh and there is ruach, okay? That is to say, there is the libidinal impulse, the inner drive that every creature that is animate is driven by. So human beings also have a nefesh. And then when you go to the next level of this hierarchy of species, the animal kingdom and the human kingdom, according to this biblical understanding, have also a ruach. There is an animating spirit or a breath that both the animal and the human being share. But then clearly Qohelet is trying to make a distinction beyond that, but observes that even though we do share a nefesh and a ruach, we share an impulse and we share a breath, that eventually expires. So there's a limit in terms of how many impulses you can act on and how many breaths you can breathe. And whether you're an animal or whether you're a human being, eventually that expires. What distinguishes us then between the animal and the human? What is the difference? What difference can a human being discern that Qohelet is suggesting here as you go from here into verses 21 and 22? Is there any difference? Because he says in 21, who knows whether the human spirit ascends and the beast spirit descends. Lamata la'aretz, right? Descends to the earth or into the earth. Right? The understanding from Qohelet's perspective is that there really is no, on Qohelet's own terms, there is no afterlife. But there is already an allusion to the sense that the spirit is moving through the world, and that a spirit ascends somewhere, and a spirit will descend somewhere. But there is no such thing for Qohelet yet as an afterlife. We see with the later interpreters, especially in the medieval period and beyond, that there is a need and a yearning for there to be something more that allows for the development and the evolution of an understanding of an afterlife. But here right now, Qohelet is basically just perplexed and says again, it's a mystery. I don't know. Mi odea. Ruach b'nei adam ha'olehi lamala, v'ruach ha'beimai yoredeti lamata la'aretz. I just don't know. Mi odea. But what did I see, though, that comes out of this? Whether or not I can confirm where the spirit goes upon death, I can confirm one thing, that there is nothing better that a person should rejoice in their works, for that is the human being's share. Because who really knows what will come after? But we do know one thing, that as human beings, we make meaning by doing things, and we make meaning out of our own experiences, which is what distinguishes us from animals. That is something that we know. We may leave the result to those who come after us, but if by being present to each moment of doing whatever it is that we're doing, we apply a skillful means to that moment, and that distinguishes us from animals. Regardless of where the spirit goes, we know that in this moment, by being present to the moment, with that awareness that Qohelet is alluding to, that even though everything is born and that everything will eventually die, we have the capacity to be able to make meaning of this moment and in this moment. That's why later on, great philosophers like Ernst Cassirer, the great German Jewish philosopher, said that what distinguishes the human being from the animal is that we are a species that are homo symbolicos. We're not just homo sapiens, but we're homo symbolicos, which means that this species is unique insofar as we make meaning of everything that happens and everything that we do. And we should not neglect, as Bev said, between those signposts to find ways to make meaning. It sounds cliched, perhaps, but it's an observation that Qohelet has to go through many, many trials and tribulations and experiments, as we saw in chapter 2, in order to be able to come to this realization. We must make meaning of the experiences that we have. We must make the time that we have count. Yes, Morton.
No, I was looking.
And as a species, we have consciousness. We know, animals don't have the same kind of consciousness. People
Well, Qohelet wouldn't necessarily have known as much as we know now. And the truth is that that's not entirely the end of the story in terms of consciousness. It's getting more and more complex the more that we know about different species, the animal species and human species, what the level of consciousness is of a dolphin versus an amoeba versus a human being. It's different, but there is a kind of consciousness that has been discovered and recorded within different animal species that we are surprised about, that Qohelet probably would have been surprised to discover. We know more about that than our ancestors like Qohelet did, but still, even notwithstanding that, Bev, what did you want to say?
No, I want to say
qualify.
that, we can argue about how much consciousness other species have, but we can see the result of our consciousness in the world, and we don't necessarily see the result of the consciousness of animals in the world.
That's true, and that's why Qohelet will also say in humility, mi odea. We can't understand what happens within the realm of the sea or the sky because we don't live there. We live under the sun. Right. So you're right. All we can really see is the result of our consciousness and the way that we make meaning of what we have access to. That's beyond us, right? Those other realms.
I was taken by what verse 18.
Mm-hmm.
So you translate, I said in my heart, in regard to human beings, God sifted them out to show them they are but beasts. Well, that's a very important difference,
Hmm.
Qohelet, between humans and beasts. So there are, first of all, it talks about the relationship with God as being different.
Hmm.
And then it talks, it implies that human, and it goes to the point that you were just discussing. I mean, there's a sentience, like there's something that goes beyond pure sentience. It's
Right.
an ability to reflect on one's place in the world.
Yeah, it's a very obscure verse that you're touching on. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here, but here's another rendering of it in JPS if this helps anymore. I went with Alter over there, but here's what JPS says. So I decided as regards human beings to dissociate them from divine beings and to the fact that they are but beasts. So that's a different way of reading
Yeah.
it, right?
The Art Scroll Chumash, the Art Scroll Tanakh says, then I said to myself concerning men, God has chosen them, but only to see that they themselves are as beasts.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I'm not quite sure what that means. But only to see.
Well, it's linked to verse 19.
Yeah. For the
Ki
fate of
mikra
man.
b'nei ha'adam mikra ha'be'ema mikra echad lahem.
Yeah.
Right? So you sift through it, even amidst all the accomplishments of human beings, and even though we have this consciousness, the fate of both species is the same. It's a single fate. One dies and the other dies, right? So we shouldn't have a kind of arrogance to suggest this is sort of humbling in verse 19. O mutar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin ki ha'kol havel. Right? We shouldn't then come to think that, which is in contradistinction to what is discussed in Genesis, right? What is the purpose? Of one of the versions of the creation story. What is the purpose of humanity?
It's to rule over all the beasts.
That's right, because the assumption is if we have a higher form of consciousness, then we have this right or this privilege to be able to rule over everything. And so Qohelet is saying, take a step back, that if the fate of each of these species is the same, one dies and the other dies, all have a single breath, then the human being doesn't necessarily have an advantage over the beast. To say that is not, it's ayin. V'hakol ki hakol havel. If everything is impermanent, then you really look at this in the grand scheme of things. Do we really have this sense that to be able this prerogative to be so arrogant to say that we're the center of the universe and that we're the center of creation? When you look at the destruction that we have wrought as a species over the created world, you begin to feel a little bit of that that reaction that Qohelet is having to say, take a moment to take a step back,
Yeah.
right?
In 21,
Mm-hmm.
Qohelet says, he says, I mean, in this translation, who knows if a man's life breath does rise upward and if a beast's breath does sink down into the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So either, it seems to me that he's either making an assumption in his question that there is a possibility that man's rises up whereas beasts descend, or is he saying, how can you be confident that that's the case?
That's the latter. He's raising it as a question because there's people around him who are already beginning to formulate this possibility that there's an afterlife. No one's really quite been able to articulate it within the biblical canon, and Qohelet is at that stage where people are already beginning to allude to and ask questions and say, well, maybe the human spirit goes up and maybe the animal spirit goes down. We don't really know, but Qohelet says, how could you even suggest that you know that? Mio dea. Right? It's a huge question that Qohelet just leaves open. And because you can't have any certitude in being able to answer that with any real clarity, Qohelet then turns. It's linked to verse 22, right? Ra'iti ki ein tov me'asher yismach adam b'ma'asav. Because I can't know whether the spirit goes up or goes down, right? And eventually we'll be given a moral layer of saying whether there is a heaven and whether there is a hell, whether there is Gan Eden or whether there is Gehenom. All I can tell you is the only good that exists is to enjoy what you have. Rejoice in your work. Rejoice in the here and now. That's all I can say with certainty. I can't tell you about this grandiose theology of where the spirit goes and the transmigration of souls. Who knows? Mio Dea. I think it's the latter, Robert. And then as we look layer upon layer, we've looked at some of the layers of the Zohar that that really pushes against the grain of Qohelet and actually says and does a very creative misreading and suggests actually there is Gilgul Neshamot, there is reincarnation, there is a turning over of the souls, there is an up, there is a place where it ascends to, there is a place that it can descend to. It's not in the text itself. It's misreading the text to be able to share with us these ideas that come later in the history of Jewish ideas. But the pshat that we talk about, the contextual meaning of Qohelet on its own terms is, who really knows? It's just a mystery. I cannot say. With all humility and all due respect, who really knows? But I do know one thing, there's nothing better than rejoicing in the good that you have right here, right now, which comes, it's the fruit of your labor and the toil of your hands. That is something that I can say with certitude that is good because you can enjoy it while it lasts. It's here and it's now. What comes before and what comes after, who knows?
So
And
work
that's
is
an interesting
interpreted-
perspective, right? Go ahead, Bev.
Work is interpreted as anything that you do on earth, which is your calling.
Yes. He sometimes refers to it, Qohelet refers to it as Amalav, but here it's B'ma'asav, which is a little bit different, right? There's the element of, there's a distinction between the toil that you're, so kind of like your labor, right? Marxists would talk about it as, as your labor, your ability to be able to produce something. But then there's also ma'asav, which is different than your toil. That is, like, what are the good works that you do? What do you do, for example, what's the volunteerism that you do? What are the acts of Gemilut Chesed, of loving kindness that you do? And that's different than just toiling for profit.
Right.
And Qohelet says, I've toiled and toiled, and I've amassed all this profit, but what good is it? But my ma'asim, those are things where I can imbue them with meaning. Toil is just about trying to create profit from toil. So he is making a distinction. He's saying the goodness that I see, the tov, that will allow us to rejoice comes from my ma'asim, the things that I can do as opposed to the toil that I make in this world. It's a very nuanced point you're bringing up, Evan. I think it's important, and I think we should hold Qohelet to be as consistent as possible in making that distinction between amalav and ma'asav. Right, Amal
is what you do,
from
or
ma'asim,
what you make, what you bring forth, what you create.
It's both, but it really is from la'asod is doing, right? Amal is more of the sense of the toil of your labor, which may or may not produce something aside from profit. But ma'asav allows you the ability to enjoy and to have pleasure, to rejoice in it, right, in your works. So it's a very fine distinction, and we're going to have to continue to see if Qohelet is consistent here. I have a feeling Qohelet will be consistent with that terminology, and it's good that we're zeroing in on it.
One other comment is, because of this time being so difficult, everyone is printing the obituaries in the Gazette, so they're at length there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've been reading some of them because they're interesting. And so you get a whole series of things where the career is sort of mentioned, but then they go to, all the other things that the person did that made him a worthy person,
Have you noticed that? Have you noticed an inversion of the priorities that,
Yeah.
that once upon a time used to be all about careers,
Right.
and less so about the things that people have done that made them a worthy person? Is that shifting now?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sort of a reflection on these are the good works of this person, the relationship to family and to the world and to doing things and, to make the world a better place. So I'm sensing that's coming through more.
Isn't that ironic, though, that it takes isolation and this confrontation with our mortality to begin to see things differently? But that's actually important. That's a very important observation. It might also be you. You may be noticing this in a way that you didn't notice it before, but the obituaries may be the same.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I once said a long time ago, You better lead, sorry, Robert.
They've
You better lead a good
metamorphosized
life.
into eulogies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
You
That's
better
right.
lead a good life because it's going to get summed up in about 11 minutes, you know? So you
Or
better
or
lead
6 words.
or 6 words.
The
Right.
6-word memoir exercise is really important to say, how can I basically distill my matseva? I have 6 to 8 words that I can put on my tombstone.
Right.
What are my words? You can talk about 11 minutes, but there's no recording on your tombstone.
That's right.
You have 6 to 8 words. What are those words? What are those qualities? What are those works? And that is not meant to be morose. Qohelet is saying is you need to reflect on the fact that this is the fate of all human beings so that we can live a meaningful life. We can rejoice. We can make a difference. If we don't realize that we have limited time, then we don't make time matter, and we don't make time count. And that's part of what he's reflecting on here in a really very poetic and powerful way through all of these e-teams. So let's take that as an inspiration to make time count. And when we return together next time at the previously same bat time, same bat channel on Zoom, God willing, there'll be no emergency interruption. And if there is, we'll also be able to pivot because we know that we don't control time. We just have to adapt. But I look forward to continuing together next time in reflecting, and also use it as a time for the course of this week, and maybe take 5 minutes a day and reflect on what kinds of e-team, what moments of time you're experiencing, and see how many of those signposts you are navigating and slaloming through in the course of a week. It would be interesting to notice that, I think. So thank you, everyone.
Oh,
Yasher Koach.
and Shabbat Shalom to you.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. We're going to be back at 6 if you're around. We'd love to see you, but have a restful and peaceful Shabbat together.
Same to you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.